So it's a pleasure to be speaking here at the INET speaking series. Today, I will sort of highlight some results from some recent research, a particular paper that I published that came out at the beginning of this year. And as stated, I can take questions at the end, but you can also feel free to try to interrupt me during the middle if you want to clarify something, and I will try to give opportunities for that intervention. So the title is, yes, insights from my Harmony growth model. So economic growth modeling we need here. And what I'm going to be discussing essentially is highlighting results from this paper. It came out sort of at the end of last year, officially accepted. There's a previous paper in ecological economics also that's very similar, but this one's in biophysical economics and sustainability. So some of the goals for myself in terms of macroeconomic modeling, my background is in engineering and mechanical engineering and trained in dynamic systems and controls. So I'm trying to use these similar skill sets or dynamic systems to understand economic modeling. And like many of you, I've read the literature since that was originated effectively since I was born in the early 70s, discussing different ways of modeling the Earth. Is the finite nature of the Earth important? If you were to think that's important in a model of some sort or an economic model, how would you incorporate that? So one of my goals was to understand how to combine economic concepts as well as sort of physical concepts, so the stocks and flows of money, as well as the stocks and flows of energy and mass. And how do you combine these together into a sort of comprehensive economic framework? So that's what I'll be explaining today. And some of the motivations are, to explain or to see if we can have a model that helps us understand if the finite Earth is affecting things that we see, affecting trends that we see, such as economic trends and investment, wages and debt, or as flow, the amount of energy we're able to extract and consume. Since there's disagreement on this, right? There's, depending on which economic framework you use, you might look at the same set of data and come up with a different conclusion. So the goal here is my goal here in my economic modeling and my research is to see if we can come up with frameworks that help us sort of understand this question. And in the long term, it'd be great, if we can have models that help explain the agrarian to fossil industrial transition. And if we can better explain that, then we might have models that can better explain the fossil to renewable or a low carbon energy transition. Again, from the basis of thinking about stocks and flows of money, energy, and mass or physical flows and how they link to monetary flows. So I'm going to describe what I call the Harmony model. The name is Human and Resources with Money. That sort of derives from the papers I used essentially to combine these or to make my modeling framework. So this is a high level, simple view of essentially what I did. The question was, what's the simplest model I could come up with that has some biophysical basis in the sense that there's a population, this population consumes natural resources. They may or may not accumulate something we might call capital, physical capital, but they survive off the environment or the physical resources and have to extract those. And so there was a paper in 2014, it was roughly called the Handy paper, or Human and Nature Dynamics paper out of University of Maryland that I used for that basis. And then there are macroeconomic models that might study, economic growth, maybe broadly. They might have population in it. They might assume population exogenously, usually have factors like capital and wages, employment, debt sometimes, depending on which model you're looking at. And for this kind of model, I've used the models of Steve Keen, essentially is adding debt to what's known as the Goodwin wage and employment business cycle model. So turn from that economic growth model on the right, combine it with a physical growth model on the left, and combining these to have a coherent framework. So this slide will discuss roughly how the model is set up. There is something out there in the world, some resources, I'm just calling them nature here. In my model, the results I'm going to discuss with you today, these are the resource is like a tree or a forest, so it can grow back and you can deplete it. So it's a regenerative natural resource. And the economy essentially extracts this resource and does four things with the flow of this resource. And so this is the part about tracking the physical flows that then get translated into monetary flows. One thing that one source of the flows of resources is to be a fuel input into what I'm calling extraction capital. So there's two types of capital, two sectors, industrial sectors in this model. One of the sectors is the extraction sector, and it uses capital to extract more resources. So this is like drilling rigs or conceptually, or solar panels or something like that. What's the capital that extracts energy or resources from the environment? And that needs fuel. So there's some resources to operate that capital. So the job of that capital is to extract nature itself. There's a second type of capital, which essentially in the model makes more capital. So this is called the goods capital. What it does is it has capital, it needs fuel to operate, just like the extraction capital. And this capital, or these machines effectively make more machines. The goods capital is priced, and if there is any consumption left over, or if there's any flow of goods left over from production, then this goes to consumption in the macroeconomic accounting sense of household consumption. So in this model, all consumption is essentially an accounting residual. If there is leftover extraction resources or goods from whatever is produced, after it has been consumed in the intermediate nature of the economy or the intermediate sectors for their own production, whatever's left over goes to consumption of goods. There's a fourth, I'll go down to the bottom one here. So there's nature extraction for human consumption. So this essentially embodies the concept of humans, essentially people needing food to survive in a conceptual sense, so that there are some resources required to keep people alive. And so that affects the death rates of the model. So the population is mitigated by the flow of resources that end up as consumption or household consumption physically. And the fourth of these four flows that are tracked in the model is that there's nature embodied in capital. So if I make an investment decision and decide to invest a certain amount of money, that certain amount of money is associated with a physical flow of resources that have to get converted into capital, right? So capital is made of physical resources, and it also has a price. So that these four flows on the left in the green essentially highlight the physical tracking, essentially the conservation of flow of resources from the environment, if you will. And then on the right is the macroeconomic accounting. For every investment decision, there's an investment decision made for each type of capital, essentially how much money to invest in each sector translates to how much capital, new physical capital as machines you want to create. So that is the summary of the general flows of the model. And I don't know if anybody has any questions, I can type them in the chat. I'm roughly looking at them as well. But you could try to interject if you'd like. So the highlights of the modeling framework here, without going too much into the details, are it's what's known as, I guess, a Post-Keynesian structure, uses stock and flow consistent, to use that term, macroeconomic accounting of money. When a investment decision is made, firms invest based upon a fraction or a multiple of their profits effectively. And if they invest more than their profits, which is sort of the default case, then they are issued loans by a bank and they pay interest on those loans. So that comes from the Steve Keen model that he combined this idea with the Goodwin business cycle model. As stated on the previous slide, natural resources are tracked via conservation of flows, which is conceptually both mass and energy. Essentially, there is some mass we extract, like wood, and you can either use it as a structural material, or you can burn it for heat as energy. So conceptually, that's how it works. Natural resource extractions consumes more resources, the more the resource is depleted. So there's an idea that as you deplete the resource, it gets more expensive in physical units to extract. It takes more energy to extract the next unit of energy, if you will. So that incorporates this kind of idea of net energy and resource depletion. And each one of the following are required for production of each sector, and each one can limit the output. So the production of each sector is modeled effectively as a Leontief production function. So it can be limited by the amount of capital that exists and its capacity utilization. It can be limited by the amount of labor that's available in the entire economy, or it can be limited by the natural resource consumption. If there's not enough resources available to operate the machines at their full capacity, then that would limit the production output. Wages in the model. So there are, labor works for each sector, and their wages are based upon a short-run Phillips curve. Again, this is roughly just mimicking the idea of the Goodwin or the Keene and Goodwin model. So at the short-run Phillips curve, at the short-run employment, if employment is higher than some nominal targeted level of employment, then wages increase. If it's below that, then wages decrease. And the long-run wages can increase with average inflation, and I'll show an equation for this later. So I've incorporated the idea that wages can increase with inflation. And as already stated, investment is a function of profits. So if you have more profits, there are more investment. And if you invest more than your profits, then you take a loan from the bank and accumulate debt. So the only debt tracked in this model is private debt by firms, as opposed to tracking government debt or household debt. That does not exist in the results I will show you. So this is fairly typical of the post-Keynesian approaches, which is to say prices are a markup on the cost of production. So there are some amount of cost to buy intermediate inputs and pay wages and pay interest payments. And the price is essentially some fraction higher than this. So the markup mu, and I will show results that assume a constant markup. I'll also show results that compare what I'm calling the full cost of production with the marginal cost of production. So that's what I'm describing here. So the cost of production are a few different parts here. One is depreciation. So that's could be incorporated into the cost of production, such as regulated utilities, for example, can put charge for the cost of depreciation. There is the cost of interest payments on debt, which is essentially a rate of interest times the amount of debt. There is the labor cost, which is wages times how much labor there is. And in this model, both sectors have the same, or labor in both sectors have the same wage W, but there's a different amount of labor that goes back and forth between each sector. And then finally, there's the intermediate purchases of goods, G, and extracted resources, E. So there's the cost of intermediate purchases as well. So this is the full cost in the sense that it has all 5 of these terms. The marginal cost that I will show in some results ignore interest payments and depreciation with the thought that there are many sectors that maybe are based upon marginal cost changes. And I was just curious to see how the model results would change if you assume one cost model versus another. As mentioned, here is the wages per person taken from Steve Keen's work, 2013. Wages, the Phillips curve type function is just plotted as this cartoon diagram on the right, where the targeted employed fraction would cross the, be a value of 0 on the y-axis, in the sense that if you were exactly at the targeted employment rate, then there would be no change in wages. So that's this function of lambda, or lambda is essentially participation rate. And then there are 2 other factors. So there's a W1 times I, that's inflation. So if W1 is 1, then wages increase exactly with inflation. W1 is 0, then wages do not increase with inflation. The W2 term, again, can range a number from 0 to 1, perhaps larger to 1, depending on what you want to understand in the model. And that's based upon the rate of change of employment. So if the rate of change of employment is increasing, wages might increase. If the rate of change of employment is decreasing, then wages might decrease based upon that number. So I play around with changing those numbers from W1 and W2 as 1, which is wages sort of increase with inflation and changes in the economy. And by setting them to 0, you can take that effect away, and that wages are no longer influenced by inflation. That has some implications for trying to understand some insights that I'll highlight here as we go forward. So the model is not calibrated to the real world, but I'm selling to you that because of its structure, it has a lot of insights into understanding trends in the real world, and I highlight these trends for the global economy and for the United States as we go forward. So keep in mind that the causal effects kind of assumed in the model. What's a decision? If sectors invest in new capital, that's kind of like a decision within the model. Then we figure out is how much labor is needed, and therefore you can calculate employment and wages from that information. Then determine if capital or labor or resource consumption is limiting output. And if it is limiting output, then adjust the total output down, the total gross output X, adjust that output down, and then sort of recalibrate the factors to account for that. And just as a reminder, household consumption is what they might call fully accommodative. So consumption is not a behavior in this model. It is in many post-Keynesian models in the sense that consumption is a function of how much wages or savings you might have. But in this case, it's just a residual. So Y is the total GDP or net output. So subtracting investment from that and subtracting the change in value of inventories, by definition, is how much consumption there is in the model for household consumption. So other things to keep in mind are two things to compare the results. This definition of cost, which I've explained to you already. I also changed the concept of efficiency. So there's a term that represents how much fuel a machine needs to operate. So I reduced this amount of fuel, which is to say increasing the efficiency of the capital to operate, to understand how the results of the model change from that. And that's a function of investment. So the efficiency can only change if you invest in new capital, which is to say it's still an exogenous change, but the change can't occur unless you actually make new capital, which kind of makes sense in the real world. I can't just make my car more efficient by wishing it. I have to actually buy a new car that is more efficient to change that effect for the capital base overall. So those are two things I changed. The model grows from equilibrium condition of a small economy. So it's zero growth or steady state economy. And then I changed some things from there to inhibit or to induce growth. Just to let you know, again, resource extraction is equal to this expression, these four terms multiplied together. So the delta Y is essentially a technological parameter that you can play with and increase. I increase that to induce growth in the model. Y is the amount of resources remaining in the environment. So as the resource base goes to zero, you can't extract it. So that's a feedback that says you cannot extract. It's not physically there. And the capital is K, and CU is capacity utilization. So you need capital that operates at some utilization. Its effectiveness, how much resources it extracts, is a function of how much is left there, and some exogenous technology factor. So a small economy has a small extraction parameter, and what I'm showing here, it starts from this small economy or the steady state economy, and then the growing economy, I increase this extraction parameter at an exogenous rate. So that's not endogenous to the model. So I just increase it at some rate to a new constant level, and this induces a growth pattern that I'm basically going to explain to you here. Okay, so here's a typical result. I'm just going to explain this one chart, and then there'll be several charts of other results that have a similar look to them. So I'm showing four results on one chart. The solid lines represent this full cost assumption, has all cost factors, and the dashed lines have this marginal cost assumption, which do not include depreciation and interest payments. Other than that, the model is the same, although they start from slightly different steady state conditions. So in this model, the maximum amount of resources is 100, and then the resources get extracted at some rate, and the resource base depletes, but you can have a steady state rate of extraction when these levels are flat. So it's the resource is essentially being extracted at the same rate that it's being regenerated, because it's like a forest. So that's what's represented by the solid lines in the full cost model. In the marginal cost model, there's a little bit of an overshoot of how much is extracted, and then a rebound into an eventual steady state economy. So that is the basics of this one. And so the left is how much natural resources are left in the environment. On the center chart here is the amount of capital accumulated. So as the economy grows, it takes these resources, it embodies these resources into capital, and the capital base grows. Again, I will highlight the effects of efficiency change here as we go forward later, but again, just note that the efficiency change is, for example, from the black lines to the gray lines. So the black solid line has no efficiency increase. The gray line has an exogenous efficiency increase, and you accumulate more capital. in both cases, or you deplete the resource more fully. So I'll explain that a little bit more detail later. And the population also increases. So if you essentially, in the growing economy, you accumulate capital and you accumulate population. So there are several types of these factors that I show in the model. There's the resource extraction rate on the left. By increasing this extraction parameter, essentially induces growth. You would increase the extraction rate, which means you can do more things in the economy and support more capital and support more people. So that's essentially a pretty kind of standard looking result. You can translate. So these are all physical results. The capital in the plot I showed you is a concept of a physical quantity of capital. And the middle chart here is the net output. So this is real GDP calculated within the model. So these all kind of have a similar, just kind of increasing trend, and I'll highlight some interesting patterns after just these intro slides of results. On the right is a participation rate in the model. It's targeting a 60% participation rate as a kind of standard number for a proportion of the population that is working. And so it varies a little bit as the population, as the economy grows and then settles down to a steady state. And that's essentially roughly expected, but that's just to show it doesn't vary tremendously. On the right now, I've changed one chart with what I call the net external power ratio. This is normally called energy return on investment, or you might call it dynamic energy return on investment or power return on investment. But what this is what's the extraction rate of resources in the total economy, how much in the energy sense, how much resources are being extracted, minus how much resources are being consumed by the energy sector or extraction sector itself, divided by the resources consumed for the extraction sector. So this is essentially a metric of how much resource extraction is left over for the goods economy and the consumption of households. And there's always notions about thinking about how to relate real world calculations of energy return on investment, of energy technologies to states of the economy. And so this is just me here telling you that this model doesn't input energy return on investment metrics into it, but it can back them out because it has all the requisite features to be able to do this calculation. So this is a calculation from the model. It's not an input into the model. We can calculate other kinds of economic metrics, wage share on the left, profit share in the middle. Profit shares raise as the economy grows, and then they decline as the economy comes to a stagnation point. Now, again, all these results in the upper right, I'm stating are with full wage bargaining power. I'm going to highlight some effects as if you take away this bargaining power, or say take away the effect for wages to be increasing with inflation. And on the right is the debt ratio. So I'm tracking debt. Companies invest more than their profits. They accumulate debt to pay for this investment. But when the economy goes to a steady state, the debt ends up going to zero in this particular case because they want to invest a certain amount based upon their profits, but the physical resources constrain them from actually being able to make that investment. Their profits end up being much higher, but their profits end up being similar for a while, but they actually can't invest more because of a physical constraint. So they can't keep accumulating debt and they end up paying back their debt. All right, so I'm going to talk about some insights from these types of results, but by packaging them in a similar way. And I have a blog post that summarizes these results. So insight number one, that efficiency begets more consumption and accumulation and not less. This is essentially the idea of the Jevons Paradox. So here's the same result I showed earlier. This is an available natural resources in the environment, and the change from the black solid line, let's say the full cost line, to the gray solid line is an increase in efficiency of operating capital, operating machines. And so when you increase the efficiency of operating machines, nothing else changing in the model, you can deplete the resource more fully, or you can increase the depletion of the resource. You can essentially afford to get the next bit of resource that is more costly to extract in the energy sense of the word. So I've moved that up to the top left. I'm going to show some other charts for the same simulations. So I already showed this, the resource extraction rate. So just to highlight that, the increase in efficiency increases the rate of extraction, the flow of resources from the environment. This would be like increasing the rate of oil production, if you will. So that's from the black line to the gray line at the top. The population increases. If I make machines more efficient, there is more resource flow, not only to accumulate more machines, but also to accumulate more people. And depending on how you weigh that idea in the model, essentially that's what happens. Capital and, well, here's capital on the right. So if you make it more efficient, you can accumulate more capital, right? So effectively, the model is set up this way. If you need less resources to operate your existing capital, but you can afford to extract more resources, in some sense, there's an inherent choice trade-off in the model. You can accumulate people and accumulate capital. And depending on how you kind of make choices in the model or set up parameters, you might accumulate a little bit more capital and a little bit fewer people, or a little bit more people and a little bit less capital. But essentially, they're both physical items, physical entities, if you will, capital and population, that need resources in order to operate and maintain themselves. So this is, I would say, maybe not a super novel result, but it just proves and shows that, okay, this model represents this general Jevons Paradox type of idea. And it does it, I would say, based upon its physical basis for thinking about the economy. So insight number 2, economy shows the same energy and size scaling as biological growth. So a lot of people kind of think about biological growth, and it has a certain relationship between energy consumption and size. And when we think about this same energy consumption and size relationship in an economic model. So here is data from a 2001 paper, or it's just a calculation from a simple model in a 2001 paper looking at metabolic power on the y-axis, so essentially how much energy does an animal consume versus its body mass. So this is, say, for an animal or a mammal like a cow. And it has this certain relationship. The basal metabolic power, as anybody who's read on this knows, it's been a discussion for many decades, essentially scales to the 3/4 power, this 0.75 notion. So as the mass of an animal gets bigger, its energy consumption does not get bigger linearly, it increases more slowly than the mass. So it increases from mass to the 0.75 power. So a 10 times more massive animal only consumes something like 5.6 times more energy consumption at rest. So that's what's kind of shown there. And so I can plot this similar kind of metric from my model. So I can say, what's the natural resource extraction rate in the economy versus the quantity of capital that exists in the model. So in here, capital is a physical context, and my model is not a value of capital, although the price doesn't change much. So if I plotted this versus the price of capital, it would look practically the same in this particular model. So what's the point here? Just look at the solid lines. The full cost model essentially rises to an equilibrium size, as we saw from the previous chart. So it has pretty much a similar kind of shape. You can have a near linear or has essentially superlinear growth early at low capital quantity, but then as it accumulates capital, it goes to this sublinear scaling where capital accumulates faster than resource extraction increases. And the marginal cost has this little overshoot in size, if you can recall from the previous. So it has this other kind of looking pattern where it reaches a maximum resource extraction rate and capital level, but then it kind of comes back and down to the right. So there's a clockwise pattern to this marginal cost. But to put it more in the line, in kind of the terminology of biological growth, essentially on the left, if you add the gray line and the middle black line, then you get the top black line, which is labeled as dashed, but it's kind of hard to tell because I have a curve fit line on it. And so on the right, I've plotted the economic, or one of the results from my economic model into a similar type framework. The gray line is how much resource consumption goes into net growth or goes into new capital, capital that accumulates, not depreciation, but whatever overcomes depreciation. The middle black line is what you might call the basal resource consumption of the economy, how much resources are consumed just to operate what's already there. And then if you add the gray and the black line together on the right, you get the dashed line, which would be the total resource extraction akin to the total metabolic power on the left. So this is there to show, hey, they're, essentially to highlight the similarities of growth. At least my model is set up in a similar way. I don't have anything inherently that says what the scaling should be between energy extraction and capital. It's just an outcome of the model itself. All right, so insight number 3, enhanced interpretation of decoupling resource consumption from GDP. So this has somewhat been implied already, but not fully explained. So here are data of essentially from the real world. This is global. These are global data indicating the growth rate of primary energy on the y-axis. 1%, is it growing at 1% a year, 2% a year, 3% a year, for example? And on the x-axis, the growth rate, gross world product. Is it growing at 1, 2, 3, 4% a year? Each dot is a year of data from 1900 to 2018. And then I have a very crude curve fit here where I've just averaged blocks of 12 years to sort of highlight what the general pattern is. The black line here on the left is a 1-to-1 ratio. So if the data are aligned with this black line, that means that the growth rate of primary energy is exactly the same as the growth rate gross world product. The red line represents a 2/3 ratio, which seems to characterize the growth rates after the 1970s or after the early 1970s. So highlighted here, essentially before 1970, from we could say the 1910s to 1970 approximately, the world on average had a 1-to-1 relationship between primary energy growth and gross world product. And then after the 1970s had what people would call, relative decoupling or declining energy intensity, where gross world product increases at roughly 3% a year and the growth rate of primary energy increases at roughly 2% a year. So it's along this 2/3 slope line. All right, so these are the data. And then when I plot this same type of thing for my model, I get what I would consider a similar looking pattern. So again, these 4 plots are the same 4 plots of scenarios I've showed you before. And if you're in the, again, below this 1-to-1 line, you would be in what is called relative decoupling. And my model starts from a 0-0 point in the sense that I'm starting from a steady state economy, so a 0 growth rate and 0 real GDP, and then it grows in a clockwise fashion. So it kind of goes up and to the right, slightly above or near the 1-to-1 line, and then it reaches a peak resource extraction rate. The resources become constrained. The economy can no longer grow at an increasing rate, so the economy starts to grow at a slower rate as it approaches a new steady state, but at a larger level, and it follows this clockwise pattern. And so what I'm claiming here is this is the same sort of clockwise pattern we see in the real world economy. And so we could ask, okay, was the 1970s, in fact, the change there due to resource consumption limits, and that the economy reconfigured itself in some way, in a similar way that my model is implying? So again, relative decoupling's growth rate of resource extraction is less than the growth rate of GDP, and that's in this section. And so my model sort of inherently says, hey, the economy would transform into this relatively decoupled state after growing in a superlinear state for a while, or growing in a near 1-to-1 or slightly increasing energy intensity state. It would sort of do this if your only rules are as I've imposed in the model. And then when it can't grow any faster, it's essentially forced to grow, to move into a relatively decoupled state, which is to say it's not necessarily a conscious choice to become more efficient, because this pattern occurs even for simulations in which I'm not exogenously increasing the efficiency of machines. So that's what I'm going to kind of highlight here. So there does seem to be more decoupling, if you will, on these scenarios for a couple of reasons. More relative decoupling, which means you're further from the 1-to-1 line down to the lower right. So if you use marginal cost rather than full cost, so that would be going from the black solid to the black dash line, or the gray solid to the gray dash line. And the only difference there would be using comparison there as a full cost model versus a marginal cost model. The marginal cost model also accumulates more debt, private debt. So you could, in some sense, say that the accumulation of private debt might incentivize more relative decoupling from the data. And the second thing I highlight is if you increase the efficiency of resource consumption of capital, well, then you can have more apparent relative decoupling as well. So that'd be going from the gray or from the black solid line to the gray solid line, or from the black dash to the gray dash line. So indeed, anyone who claims increasing efficiency is more relative decoupling in this energy versus GDP sense, the model is consistent with that, but it's not the only explanation of why you might increase relative decoupling, right? So this is one among many explanations. So that's my takeaway from this exercise, or I think a takeaway for you listening to this presentation. Insight number 4, labor wage share and capital wage share versus resource consumption. Is there some trade-off between capital and labor, if you will? So this is often discussed, particularly since in the last couple of decades, wage inequality has been more on the minds of people than it maybe was before that. So on the left is wage share, on the right is profit share for different scenarios here. So I'm pointing out on the left, the solid lines are simulations in which the workers have full bargaining power during the entire simulation. So the wage share declines as profits increase, but then the wage share increases when you approach the steady state economy again, and they increase back to roughly the level they were at the beginning. So if we look at the corresponding chart on the right, so this is the profit share, again, the same two simulations, the solid black line and the solid gray line. Once you start to reach peak resource extraction rates, the profits no longer stay high, but then they decrease as the companies pay off all of their debt, and their profit share essentially goes to zero, and they're investing in capital at exactly the rate to replace depreciation, and you have a steady state economy. So that's if workers have full bargaining power, the solid lines. Now, what if the workers have bargaining power taken away from them in the model, which means I change the wage equation so that wages no longer increase with inflation. And so the gray line, dash line is the marginal cost model, and the black line is the full cost model. And you can see the wage share declines continuously to zero for the full cost model, and it declines and then stays at a lower steady rate for the marginal cost model. And the profit share increases on the right for the full cost model, it stays higher. And then for the marginal cost model, the profit share stays higher for a while and decreases. And the trade-off here is higher debt payments. And that's why wage share is lower, profit share goes to zero, but the difference is increased interest payment. All right, so there's essentially kind of a summary of what the model is saying about if you, in some sense, have a political-like decision or a business decision inside the model that represents something about wage bargaining power. And interesting thing here is to look at the real-world data. These are data of the US. And the black line is the wage share. It's not showing up on the y-axis, so apologize for that. But the black line refers to the left axis, which is the percentage of value added that goes to wages. So it's essentially the wage share. And then the right line is energy consumption per person in the United States, increasing until the 1970s, and then roughly flat from the 1970s until the 2000s, and then it kind of declines after that. So I'll highlight some ideas from a similar plot from the model. So this is the full cost model with full wage bargaining power. So the wage share is the black line. And the left axis, the resource extraction per person, which is a parallel to energy consumption per person in the US, is in the red and corresponds to the right axis of the left image. So this is if they have full bargaining power. It doesn't look like what's going on the right at all. But if I show the results where I take away the bargaining power, resource consumption now rises and then stays roughly flat in terms of resource extraction per person. There's a lower population for this result as well. And then the wage share or income share is roughly flat or slightly decreasing, and then more rapidly decreasing after I take away the wage bargaining power. So the takeaway is that this is kind of a similar trend. It's kind of roughly flat in terms of wage share. And then when I take away bargaining power at the peak extraction rate, so the choice to change the bargaining power on the left, I specifically chose that time in the simulation because it relates to the time of peak resource extraction per person. So that's why I chose that time to do it in the simulation. But you get this flat and then downward trend in wage share and you get this upward and then flat looking trend and resource extraction or energy consumption per person as well. And so I look at this and I think, all right, is this a coincidence or not? There's a lot of discussions about, inequality, energy transition, and what this, I would say, what my paper implies, or at least provides as a hypothesis, is that the change in bargaining power, let's just say lower bargaining power for Western or European and the United States, North American workers, occurring at the same time or soon after resource constraints in the economy is maybe not a coincidence. Maybe this restriction in wage bargaining power is a response to the inability or difficulty in making profits in the face of physical energy resource constraints after the 1970s. So here's the marginal cost result. It kind of, on the left, it's the same result I've shown before in wage share, but the marginal cost results decreases but then stays flat. I see one, question there, is this correlation or causation? I guess I don't have correlations in this model. I'm quote unquote causing the bargaining power to change at one particular time and then seeing what the effect is. In some sense, this is how the model works. You take away bargaining power and then you will get the wage share decline when you can no longer increase resource consumption rates. That's just effectively what happens in the model. That model being right or wrong is certainly a discussion, but that's just kind of how it works. I think we can follow up on that question in Q&A. So is there a forced trade-off between full profits and full wage bargaining power? This is effectively the question, right? If I have full bargaining power again, but the same simulation, the wage share rises, profit share goes to zero, and you end up with a steady state economy. Does a capitalist economy need a way to essentially ensure or allow for profits to occur in firms? We could ask that question. And if you have to take away wage bargaining power to ensure firms, or if you have to decrease wages to ensure firms are profitable, then is that something that is incentivized and affected by resource constraints, but in a way that people don't normally realize? That's essentially the proposition I'm kind of wondering about and asking after producing this model. Here's just a highlight of thinking, can you relate metrics like energy return on investment, sort of biophysical metrics, my net external power ratio here on the left, to wage share or outcomes or livelihoods, some sort of metric, any kind of metric of well-being. I don't have sort of generic metrics of well-being in the model, so wage share is perhaps the closest thing, but you perhaps can show some changes here. Lower net external power ratio for the dashed lines on the left when you have decreasing wage bargaining power on the right and a decreasing in wage share. This is just one example of how you might be able to show examples or comparisons between these. So I have one more insight, but we're kind of at time, so I won't go over this one. I'll see if there's other questions, and if there's not questions, then I will go over this final insight, which is about looking at the structure of the input-output tables in the model and how the changing structure of the flows of money in the intermediate transactions here in the model mimic the change in structure or the change in input-output table flows within the US economy since 1947 to roughly the present time. So again, giving me some insights into that the model might be having some fundamental structural feedbacks that are correct or representative of what happens in the real world. So I won't highlight that. That takes a little bit of time to go over. So the final takeaways, the Harmony model consistently tracks physical and economic flows. That's kind of how I've structured it, or that was the goal of making the model. I'm claiming it explains some important coincident trends in energy and money distribution, such as wage shares, debt, and input-output table structure, which I didn't highlight at the end of the presentation here due to time. It shows how economic decisions, such as how much you invest or changing the rules that affect wages, at least in the model sense, can relate to physical resources and population, or how there can be some interplay between the physical flows of resources and essentially rules for wages, rules for money flows. And this, I hope this serves as a base model or a base idea to add components to and to calibrate to real world economies. And that's what I'm working on now, is adding other sectors and trying to calibrate to real world economy size metrics so that this can have insight for modern contemporary questions. So I'll end there, and thanks for the presentation time. And I'm highlighting my 2 papers on the economic model here. And of course, my book that came out a couple of years ago, The Economic Superorganism, which highlights some of these ideas. It's not so much on the model, but it highlights other ways of thinking about energy in the economy in a physical and monetary sense of the word. So I'm looking at just some of the chat window here. So anybody can ask a question, I guess, verbally or in the chat if you'd like. I'll answer it.
Yes, thank you very much, Carey. That's great. So yes, as Carey says, if anyone's got any questions, please just either type it into the chat there, or you can just turn on your camera, your microphone, and ask away. Thank you very much.
Right. Well, I'll try to go to this first one here, which says the results suggest a long-term equilibrium after transition from one base state of the economy to a future new baseline state. Is this inevitable in the way the model is set up? What about the chances of an economic and societal collapse, for example, triggered by environmental disasters after reaching tipping points? So yeah, in this model, because the only thing, well, the environment, if you will, is very simple. It's just there's this resource that you get to extract, and it's like a forest. So it is set up to, if you don't extract it too quickly, you will end up at another steady state eventually. You can overshoot and then come down. So whether you call that collapse or not, you can definitely overshoot and end up at a different level. And there are times parameters you can put into the model to where you might completely collapse before the resource is able to grow back. So if you extract resources at too high of a rate, then you could extract them before they can come back and or before they can grow back fast enough to maintain a steady state economy. So you can sort of simulate a collapse. The original biophysical model that I used, which had no economics in it, essentially that was one of the point of the paper. That's, Motash Shari, 2014, this handy paper. And that was one of the things that they were essentially demonstrating, is the ability to collapse or to maintain a steady size based upon resource extraction rate and the sort of inequality metric in their model as well. So I see another question in the chat here, so I'm going to try to read it. I'll just read it so I don't have to read it and then think about what it says. With respect to the physical part of the model, is there a scope for, quote, conversion losses in the conversion of the natural resources into something useful, like consumption or capital? So I'll read the rest, but I think the answer is, well, I'm sort of doing it, but not really doing it. And I think I'm getting your point. I am going to try to track the actual sort of loss conversion and energy more concretely as I go forward. But the question continues. In energy terms, I was thinking this would be the difference between primary energy consumption inputs versus useful work, as Ayers and Moore have calculated output, where there is a slight decoupling GDP versus primary energy consumption, but as you move towards the physical conversion limit, but there is not as much of a decoupling between GDP and useful work, both scale and growth rates. So yeah, I think I'm 100% in agreement with the spirit of your question. And yeah, the first version of my model doesn't have an efficiency per se, or a calculation of how much work is being done by this model. I guess I could do it, but then the amount of work, the model at the moment is so abstract that the amount of work being done is, well, I don't know if it would be completely arbitrary, but I could have calculated something called work, but I didn't, I guess, because I thought that would just be like adding parameters for the sake of calculating work. But to your point, in my efforts here to calibrate, I'm trying to calibrate to the US economy first. My goal is to do exactly as you say, which is to have an actual efficiency of converting primary energy into work. That work might be measured as physical products coming out of sectors or electricity. I've got to think about how I'm going to do that. But I'd say my goals are exactly as you suggest. So I'm in agreement with the spirit of your question and comment. Not seeing any others. Oh, wait, there's one more. Yeah. For reading papers, I'm curious about your plans for multiple energy sources, both in source, like non-renewables versus renewables, and perhaps semantically different uses like heat, electricity, and fuels. I'm also interested in how I'm going to do that. So I have been working on essentially incorporating a quote unquote fossil resource, which I can model pretty much the same exact way I'm modeling this regenerative resource. Just sort of don't give it a regeneration rate above zero. Just say it's got a regeneration rate of 0. And due to how the model works in terms of not having a consumption behavior, this poses questions for how you know how much one resource is going to be consumed or extracted versus another. At the moment, I'm still trying to base it on just differential investment, right? What's the profitability of one resource versus another? Net profitability dictates the investment. By definition, if you have more capital from investment in one sector versus another, you'll be able to, extract that resource more, at least until it's depleted. So that's what I'm playing with right now. But when I calibrate to real world, essentially the model now has an abstract description of what the resource is, but calibrated to the real world, I probably will not be able to get away with a very abstract representation of the resource itself. So this is a good question, and that's, it is the goal. I think, that's what we need in an economic model. So I'm trying to do that. And for the purposes of one project that I'm working on with a larger team, we are trying to characterize, for example, the greenhouse gases associated with the petrochemical sector. And the petrochemical sector uses all kinds of different useful work or energy carriers, if you will, as you're suggesting, in terms of heat and electricity. So I'm trying to working on how to incorporate these ideas into the model. Other question, how might this model help inform policy choices such as carbon taxation to address anthropogenic global warming? So I am hoping that it can do it. So it has, effectively the features that most people want to have in an economic model to do this. So you can incorporating a government sector is, fairly standard in these approaches. I don't have anything exotic planned there other than to incorporate the government sector, which can then tax things, and I could tax one industry, the output of one industry more than another. So I do hope eventually to get there, to have this model be able to inform carbon policy. And the thought there is that this type of framework hopefully can be more accurate, hopefully not too complicated, but it can be more accurate to inform policy because it has this physical basis of how the economy works, which is to say, be an improvement on neoclassical methods or integrated assessment models that are based upon neoclassical growth theory that do not have a direct link of the physical notion of the economy to them, even though they're trying to inform us about a very important physical change in the economy. So I do hope that this can be incorporated into, whatever, an integrated assessment model or something similar to inform the policy. But yeah, it has to be calibrated to a real world economy to do that. And that's what I'm working on now. Let's see there. All right, so yeah, I appreciate anybody who's working on similar things. I see some comments. I'll take advice and insight from other people working on these kinds of ideas. So I think we all kind of need the help in the community as we go forward. We need help from each other. So please reach out to me if you have some thoughts. I just see agreement, stock and flow modeling or stock and flow consistent modeling seems to help move attention from GDP to the world balance sheet. I can just tell you as someone not, formally trained in, through university in economics, when I was looking for a method to, again, do exactly what I did for this model, blend physical notions of stocks and flows into an economic model, then it seemed like a natural the stock and flow consistent economic approach seemed like a natural way to do it for me, and it makes sense to me, and I think it makes sense more than other methods, because you can track money and debt and things in a consistent way. So I think we're maybe done with questions. I thank everyone for their time, and if you're interested in these last results, I have a paper in 2016 that kind of explains these information theory metrics, and essentially, which is the red line, the red dots, which is the paper from 2016. It's also in Biophysical Economics and Sustainability, but in its previous journal name. And it's essentially tracking energy and complexity of the economy, if you will. And what I'm claiming here is that the model results and the lines, the gray and black lines, can roughly follow the same pattern, or they do roughly follow the same pattern of the red dots, which are the patterns of the US economy. So this is to say, by tracking physical flows and associate them with prices, I track monetary flows in the intermediate sectors of the economy, and through a growth cycle, these goes through a certain pattern that's the same as the United States economy. It's easier to compare this with the United States because it has more data or more input-output tables that go back further to 1947. So I'll just leave that with y'all in case, just for video saving purposes, that is there. And again, thank you. So thank you, everyone. Comment on Simon Michaud. Yeah, I have his documents, but I haven't read them completely thoroughly. I've heard him on a couple of podcasts. So definitely think I can use his work to do some model calibration.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much, Carey. Thank you everyone for joining in, for your comments and questions as well. And yes, as again, if you'd like the link, just send me an email and I'll be able to send you a link to the recording. But finally, just yes, thank you very much, Carey. And I hope we'll see many of you at other future INET events. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.